Motion controls. Let me turn motion controls on. Now, there was one thing that stick controls cannot do that motion controls can do, and it is basically snapping onto your enemy targets. Now, I've turned motion controls on, as you can see, moving with motion controls, and you can tell it's motion controls because it's all smooth and stuff like that. And I can just whip it around like that. Now, snapping onto your targets. Look how much faster I'm able to aim onto people using motion controls. Now, motion controls is probably the closest equivalent to mouse and keyboard aiming on a PC shooter. Considering Splatoon is a console shooter and it requires a controller that has motion controls implemented into it. This is the closest we're going to get to, and it is amazing. Time and movement. Time and movement are one of the two key things about motion controls that sticks does not have. You're much quicker on aiming, you're much quicker on your movement. You can react to things so much faster, it's much more twitchy. And altogether, it's just saving a lot of time. But there's about 3 people that use stick controls, and they're in the community. They are pretty good, not gonna lie, but I wouldn't say they're good at the, I guess, top level. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, but it's the sticks that are actually holding them back from actually performing really well.
Hold the controller like no, don't stand up. No, just definitely not. No, just hold it like it's a normal thing. No, just there. You use the stick to turn like usual. Then when you want to aim, you tilt it a little bit. I've had my thumbs get tired from using buttons and sticks, but I've never gotten tired from using gyro aim because it's mostly the same action as simply holding the controller. Can you tell which of these players are using motion? The kind of motion requiring broad movements, which I'll refer to as gesture control for the sake of clarity, is mostly a relic of the Wii era.
Even your mom can play.
Motion was Nintendo's main selling point, so they wedged it into every game they could and heavily advertised the system with a flurry of exaggerated movements, waggling, and generally more activity than an average gamer's cankles can support.
Things are much quicker with the gyro. I can essentially turn the controller as quickly as I want to, just like the mouse, as you'll see later, whereas the thumbstick is limited to the sensitivity you set it to.
Some Xbox and PlayStation gamers seem to take pride in the fact that their platforms don't have motion. In Sony's case, the DualShock 4 has the same capability as Nintendo's controllers, yet motion is rarely an option in shooting games. It's not as if developers aren't willing to do the work. Many multi-platforms have gyro aim on Switch, and it's because Nintendo's audience asks for it. And that's because Nintendo has had the balls to push through the trial and error of finding something better every generation. Microsoft and Sony haven't been known to push players out of their comfort zones like this. As a result, their hardcore players are mostly free to think that motion control doesn't work without ever really being challenged about it. But if you want to talk about hardcore gamers, there's no one more hardcore than the PC crowd. The self-proclaimed master race, which retches at the thought of using anything but a keyboard and mouse for shooters. And they seem to like motion quite a bit.
The feature we're going to talk about today is the motion controls. Oh, it's so easy. Headshots, and it feels really comfortable too.
I was actually quite surprised with the amount of headshots I was able to land this game, so I think the motion controls actually fit MGS5 pretty well.
Not a very publicized thing, but it actually works really well in-game. I like the motion controls.
There's something wrong about the fact that you can use the DualShock 4, a controller that wasn't made for PC, to get gyro aim in PC games that weren't programmed to have it. Yet you can't get gyro on the PS4 itself, where the developers had direct access to the feature to include it. Imagine this for a moment. Microsoft adds gyro to their next controller, and all 3 consoles have parity with the feature. And by extension, X input on PC would natively support motion instead of having to rely on Steam configurations and workarounds. Developers add optional motion schemes to their games that players can either use or ignore forever. Everybody gets to play the way they want.
Then we're all happy!
What is the threat posed by this, and why wouldn't any PlayStation or Xbox gamer want this option to happen? You can make big swings from the elbow, or precise adjustments from the wrist. The range of movement afforded by this is huge compared to using your thumb to tilt a stick within a 1-inch radius, where the space for precise adjustment like aiming is a matter of centimeters. The difference in these inputs is so pronounced that you can see it in footage. Analog sticks aim in jolting straight lines while motion aim is fluid. When Resident Evil 4 launched on Wii, many people considered it a broken version of the game, because you weren't supposed to be able to headshot every enemy and trivialize the shooting like this. But many people also consider it the best version, specifically because the aiming is so good. Sin and Punishment 2 is another example of the same thing. Treasure had designed it with the GameCube controller and expected Nintendo's testers to say it was too hard, because if you're unfamiliar with Treasure, their games are batshit insane. Instead, Nintendo said it was too easy. They had been using the Wii Remote Nunchuck, and they made short work of segments that were challenging on a traditional controller. Good luck making movements like this with an analog stick.
Goddamn son of a bitch!
The game had to be rebalanced to work because the IR camera was like cheating in games built for analog sticks. But it's not a cheat to use your own movement. The shooting is only easier because your intentions are realized better. We have to address the illusion that dual analog is good enough, that sticks are the ideal input and that any attempt at change is a gimmick. You may have noticed that I'm not aiming at these enemies, yet the gun is finding its way to them. This is the crutch that makes dual analog viable. Because sticks are blunt and imprecise, developers have to deploy a lot of tricks to make it feel like you're aiming well. You can see the aim assist that moves your reticle onto an enemy, but there are hidden layers beyond that.
Don't even have to touch the right joystick. And then when I aim down the sights...
This little cross here that you see is actually where the bullets will bend towards. And as I go over him, you'll see it actually snaps to him. Magnetism basically means that we slow down your turning speed when you get close to an enemy. When you're inside of the magnetism cone, any movement that this guy does, your reticle will try and follow him.
Maybe you don't notice that it's helping that
Right.
much. Yeah, it just feels like you're that badass.
Yeah.
This is the reality of dual analog, an input method so poor that the game practically has to cheat on your behalf to make it work. One would think that the people who consider themselves the most skilled players would embrace the first input on console accurate enough to play without these assists, not rejected on sight. These assists are part of the reason the remote never caught on as well as it deserved. It didn't really matter that aiming was better when all you had to do was face the enemy and pull the trigger. Nintendo took the hint that many gamers weren't willing to move on, and with few exceptions, IR camera aiming died out when the Wii did. This gentleman writes that flailing your arms around isn't as good as a button press. Okay, but no one in their right mind would describe this as flailing their arms around, and believe it or not, gyro aim is better than a button press. Unless you're talking about the kind of button press where auto aim snaps you onto targets when pulling the trigger. I even saw claims that people like me have been duped into supporting motion, like brainwashed cultists. Anyone who thinks motion control doesn't work should play the Splatoon games with a stick-only scheme. According to Nintendo, up to 80% of players were using gyro in the original. That's an awful lot of people using something that doesn't work in a competitive game where you want every edge possible. If sticks are better, then you should be able to dominate all these buffoons who have been tricked into using a gimmick, right? And why would anyone be configuring gyro controls on Steam if they didn't work? Did these players buy into Nintendo's 13-year-old Wii propaganda too? If anyone has been duped into believing anything, it's the critics of motion control. I saw a lot of comments from people who thought that gyro control is bullshit just because that's what everyone told them. Then they actually used it and realized it worked really well, and were left wondering why they couldn't use the sensors in their PS4 controllers to do the same thing there. And the reason might be this. Developers probably aren't going to bother adding something that a major portion of their audience vocally despises. And this is the point I'd like to leave any motion skeptics with. If you've complained about being forced to play with motion control, you need to understand it goes the other way too. People shouldn't be forced to play without it just because you don't like it.